Our brain is capable of amazing things, but it's also vulnerable to trauma. Trauma that can leave some in a coma or permanent vegetative state. For the friends and family at their bedside, the question is, do they know I'm here? Can they hear me? To get answers to those questions, you may have to travel hundreds of kilometers after months on a waiting list for an expensive fMRI. But what's in here just might be able to bring those answers to a family's doorstep. So I'm now here with Damian Cruse. He's a research scientist at the University of Western Ontario. Hi, Damian.
Hi.
And what is this thing in the box?
So what we have here is we have an EEG recorder. So this is comprised of a laptop on which the information is recorded,
Yep.
an amplifier which the electrodes plug into, and a set of electrodes which plug into the amplifier.
So normally you'd put those electrodes on a patient's head?
That's right, exactly. Normally we'd have a series of them housed in a cap. The
Yep.
particular one that we use has 129 electrodes housed in a cap which you just stretch across the patient's head and then fasten it under their chin. And all of these electrodes come into contact with the patient's scalp.
And they record electrical activity in the brain. But can you really find out the same sorts of things about someone who's in a coma or vegetative state as a functional magnetic resonance imager can?
Well, so this is what we've been able to show, and we've been able to show that actually we can. So MRI, if you think about the primary differences between MRI and EEG, so MRI measures changes in blood flow in the brain,
Right.
whereas EEG measures the small electrical signals which are generated. But essentially it's getting at the same thing. It's getting
Brain
at
activity.
the brain activity, right? And so what we use is we use a task which asks the patients to imagine that they were performing particular movements. And we are able to look at the brain activity that the patients are eliciting when we ask them these questions. And we can tell from recording their EEG that it's indistinguishable.
Wow. So can you take me through an example? You have a patient, they're unresponsive. What sorts of questions do you ask them?
So what we do is we attach the EEG electrodes to the patient's head.
Yep.
And we ask them two very simple questions. We ask them to imagine that they're squeezing their right hand into a fist, and to imagine that they're wiggling all the toes on both of their feet. And we just ask them to do this up to about 200 times over the course of 20 minutes.
Yep.
And we record their brain activity while we're asking them to do this.
So does that give, how much of an insight into what they're capable of does that give you?
It gives a fantastic insight. I mean, these patients behaviorally, they appear to be not aware at all.
At all.
Right? From any of their behaviors, you would never think that they knew what was going on around them. But from the data that we can collect with EEG, we can tell that they understand when we speak to them, they're able to follow our commands, they're able to do this very complex task. So we know that the types of brain processes which are required to be able to successfully do that. And so really, for a healthy person to be able to do this, it's a very intensive mental feat. And for a patient, it's exactly the same.
Now the EEG, electroencephalograph, has been around for a long, long time. So what have you been able to, how have you been able to tweak it to enable you to do this really demanding task?
Exactly. So this is it. So EEG itself, the technology hasn't changed at all in pushing 100 years. The advance that we have made here is in terms of the processing of the data when it's recorded, in terms of how it's analyzed. We make use of something called machine learning to interpret the patterns of brain activity which are elicited by the patient, to be able to classify into the occasions when a patient is imagining moving their hand and when they're imagining moving their toes.
So where do you think this can be taken from here? Because it seems to me it could be an agonizing decision for, say, friends and family to discover that this person who apparently is unresponsive actually has an active brain. Can you go beyond that?
Exactly. This is one of the exciting things that the EEG affords. So with the type of task that we used, we asked people to imagine moving their hands and imagine moving their toes. You can imagine a situation where you ask a patient a yes or no question, and you simply say, if you want to answer yes, imagine you moving your hand. And if you want to answer no, imagine moving your toes. And with the type of analyses that we used, and with the potential of EEG to come up with the answers in real time, we can actually have a conversation with a patient who externally doesn't appear to be able to at all.
So the portability is a remarkable thing, because if you were in some sort of outlying community, you'd have to get to a place with an fMRI, but now you don't have to do that. But can you see this actually being portable to the extent that a family might own one and use it as therapy?
Absolutely. So EEG kits obviously vary in price quite widely. But a standard EEG kit will probably set you back about as much as a decent electric wheelchair. So you can imagine really the potential for a patient to own one personally isn't completely out of the possibilities.
It's really fantastic. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Damian Cruse is a researcher at the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario.